Thank you. And the second question was, I've forgotten it. Oh, can everybody see me? Because I can't see me on the screen.
We can't see you yet because your camera switched off.
If
But
I
don't
hold up a
worry
book like this, people can see what I'm talking about. Yeah.
If you want to be seen, you got to switch your camera on. But we can see the images on the PowerPoint, so we're good to go.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I'll make a start. Thank you for that introduction, Tony. My name is Stephen Bourne. As Tony says, I've been writing Black British history books for a very long time, since 1991, and this particular film really resonates with me. Steve McQueen's Blitz. It came out towards the end of last year. To sort of mixed reviews, which kind of disappointed me because I found it quite innovative and very emotionally charged. But before I kind of talk about the film and the people in the film, the Black characters in the film who are based on real life people, I want to just put this film into some sort of context. I'm a bit of a film buff, so as well as a historian of Black Britain. And so I'm well aware that since the Second World War, which I'm sure you all know ended in 1945, there has been dozens and dozens and dozens of World War II films. And almost exclusively, they've been about men in the armed services. Films like from the 1950s, like Reach for the Sky and the Dam Busters, and from the 1960s, like 633 Squadron and Battle of Britain. They've all focused on men in the armed services. None of them have ever focused on the home front. The home front, the women and children particularly that were left behind when the menfolk went off to fight the war, and women did as well, but the women and children on the home front, whatever background they're from, have never really been acknowledged in films. And certainly in the war films I've just mentioned, very hard to find Black or minority ethnic servicemen represented, although they did. There were many African and Caribbean men and women that joined the armed services during the Second World War. I remember Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk film from 2017. Very important to mention this in the context of Steve McQueen's film Blitz. Christopher Nolan's film Dunkirk, which was a very successful film about 8 years ago, completely excluded Black soldiers, Black British soldiers who were trying to evacuate from Dunkirk in 1940. There weren't, as far as we know, many Black soldiers there, but they did exist. At least two of them I've written about in my book, Under Fire, Black Britain in Wartime. Cyril Roberts and Patrick Nelson were captured at Dunkirk and became prisoners of war, Black soldiers. But Christopher Nolan, I have on good authority, completely resisted the idea of having Black, even the Black extras amongst the extras. So there's always been this abstinence. And that same year, there was a film that some of you may have remembered seeing or heard of called The Darkest Hour, also released in 2017, which was about Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister at the beginning of the war, 1940. And there's a fantasy sequence where he goes on the underground and meets ordinary members of the public. I don't think this happened in real life. It's never been acknowledged that it happened in real life. But one of the members of the public is a Black man. And there was criticism made of the film, partly because of this fantasy sequence of Winston Churchill going on the underground and talking to ordinary people. But how dare they put a Black man amongst them? And he had lines. I mean, he was an actor with lines. He wasn't just an extra. So even then, 8 years ago, there was this resistance to portraying Black people in a British World War II context. But you have to set, put that in the context of no home front films. So Steve McQueen's film, just simply from the home front point of view, is a rarity. But before I start talking about the film, I just want to give you a bit of understanding and insight into my own background. So my Aunt Esther was adopted into my family in 1941 during the London Blitz. My great-grandmother, who was a white mother figure in their tight-knit working class community in Fulham in West London. Esther's father, who was Guyanese, her mother had died when she was a baby. Her father, who was Guyanese, Joseph, was killed in the London Blitz in 1941. And Granny, being Granny, she'd known Esther. They'd known each other all of Esther's life. Esther was born in 1912 in this street where my family lived. Granny adopted her into my family. So by the time I was born in the late 50s, she was part of the family. The photograph that you can see of Aunt Esther was taken in 1942 with my mother. My mother is the little girl in the center of the photograph. And the very first book I ever had published was Aunt Esther's Story in 1991, which we co-authored just a few years before she died. And it was really recognized as the first book to acknowledge the life of a Black British-born working-class woman. There hadn't been any that I'm aware of before that. And during the war, Aunt Esther, this is how I discovered that there were Black British people taking part in the war effort on the home front. A couple of years ago, London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham erected a blue plaque in honour of the memory of Aunt Esther. Worked here at Charing Cross Hospital. It's outside Charing Cross Hospital. She worked here as a World War II fire warden. And that's what intrigued me. It gave me an insight that Black people did take part in the Second World War, not just in the RAF and the Army and the Navy, but as stretcher bearers, nurses, doctors. I mean, there's a whole list. Aunt Esther was a fire warden, and the fire warden was a voluntary job. She worked in a hospital. She worked in a hospital as a hospital cleaner, cleaning wards. But she volunteered as a fire warden to go up on the roof of both Fulham Hospital, where Charing Cross Hospital is now, and also when she later moved over to Brompton Hospital. She would go up on the roof during air raids to look out for incendiary bombs, and incendiary bombs were the fire bombs that the Germans dropped to set light to London, so that the big bombers that came over with bombs knew where to drop them. And her job was to have a bucket of sand and to try and put the fire out from the incendiary bomb before it took off and the bombers came over. Very, very dangerous work. But it gave me an insight into the Black presence in London and indeed the whole country during the Second World War. So that some years ago, I had a book published called Mother Country about the Black home front in the Second World War. That's now more or less out of print, but it's been revised as Under Fire, Black Britain in Wartime, 1939 to 45. That was published about 5 years ago. And as you can see from the photograph, it covers not just the home front, but the armed services as well. So you hear the stories of Dr. Harold Moody, Aunt Esther, Una Marson, Princess Adamola, who worked as a nurse at Guy's Hospital, Lillian and Ramsay Bader, who were both British-born, who served in the war and both married during the war. Ulrich Cross, who was an RAF pilot or a recruit who was highly decorated. That's a photograph of Ulrich Cross at Buckingham Palace. And then entertainers like Elizabeth Welch, then Black women from the Caribbean who joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the British Women's Army, and Snake Hips Johnson in the corner, who I'll be talking about in a minute because he is indeed featured in Steve McQueen's film. And so we come to the evacuee. The story in Blitz focuses on a young mixed heritage evacuee who lives with his white mother in the pretty much the East End of London. and it follows his story. But it was Steve McQueen was inspired to base this screenplay, this story, on the little boy from this photograph that I actually have used in my books. It belonged, the original photograph is with the Imperial War Museum. I remember some years ago, even after I'd rediscovered the photograph and used it in a book, the Imperial War Museum did a huge exhibition on evacuees in the Second World War who were in their thousands left the cities, Liverpool, Manchester, London, to get away from the air raids, the bombing. And, you know, they didn't include this photograph. And I ticked them off, as is my way of doing things. I said, you've left out the black evacuee, because there were very few photographs of black evacuees, but I have found others. But this one is probably the best known and the one that inspired Steve. So I just want to tell you that back in the 1990s, before I even wrote these books, I did meet and interview a black evacuee from the East End of London called Joseph Cozier. And Joseph was from the East End of London, evacuated with his brother and sister, and found themselves in a village hall in Great Bedwin, where the vicar and some women from the community, their community in the East End, some women from the community, the village community, I beg your pardon, offered different children to villages for fostering. But they only picked the white children. Joseph told me that afterwards there was just my sister and my brother and myself left in the village hall. And I thought to myself, I won't let this bother me. I was with my brother and sister anyway. So at the end of the day, the vicar took us to his vicarage, but he wasn't married and didn't have a clue how to look after us. So he asked one of the teachers to feed us, but she was a spinster and couldn't cook either. Instead, she fed us Garibaldi biscuits with milk and raisins for breakfast, dinner and tea. When the health visitor came, she told the vicar we must be given proper meals. But luckily for the Cozier children, Joseph and his siblings, Mrs. MacDonald, an Irish woman who had been evacuated to the same village with her two daughters, knew their family, the Cozier family, and took them under her wing. Joseph described her as a lovely woman who mended their clothes and took them for walks in the countryside. So it hasn't been easy to find stories of the real life stories of black evacuees, but I thought it was wonderful that Steve McQueen put this little boy at the center of the film. The little boy in the black and white photograph is not Joseph. We don't know the little boy's identity, but it is quite an iconic photograph from black British history. So during his adventures in the London Blitz, the little boy in the film Blitz meets Ita Ekpenyon, an African air raid warden. Although he's given a fictitious name in the film, he was based on the real life air raid warden Ita Ekpenyon. And luckily for us, well, historians and the general public, if they can find a copy, I found a copy many years ago in the British Library. He published a pamphlet, the real life Ita Ekpenyon published a pamphlet during the war in 1943 entitled Some Experiences of an African Air Raid Warden, in which he described how he challenged racism in the air raid shelter. He said, some of the shelterers told others to go back to their own countries and some tried to practice segregation. So I told the people that though I am an air raid warden in London, I'm still an African. I said that I would like to see a spirit of friendliness and cooperation and comradeship prevail at this very trying time in the history of the empire. I further warned my audience that if what I had said was not going to be practiced, I would advise those who did not agree with me to seek shelter somewhere else. So it was Ekpenyon's job, as you see in the film Blitz, to take care of his local community. Ekpenyon actually lived in and worked as an air raid warden in I think it was the Marylebone area of London, and his job was to make sure local people kept their lights out during the air raids and during the air raid warnings. The blackout, it's called the blackout. London was in darkness, so that the Germans, if there was if somebody lit up a cigarette in the street during an air raid, a German bomber all those miles up in the sky could spot it and drop their bombs. They could see even a lighted cigarette. So if Ekpenyon had seen someone light a cigarette in the street during an air raid, he had the authority to have them prosecuted and fined by the local authority. He added in his pamphlet that it amuses me to know that in the district where I work, the people believe that because I am a man of colour, I'm a lucky omen. I had heard of such childish beliefs, but I'm delighted that such beliefs exist. For wherever my duties take me, the people listen to my instructions and orders and are willing to allow me to lead them. So I am able to control them, which makes my duties lighter in these troublesome days. And he did some very brave things, and it's wonderful to see him, Ekpenyon, represented in the film Blitz. And sadly, he didn't live very long. I think he had heart trouble and died in 1951. But at least he left a legacy behind with his pamphlet, which tells his wartime story. And then we come to Ken Snakes Johnson, who's a fascinating character. He was a young Guyanese law student. His middle-class parents sent him from Guyana to England to be educated. He was born in 1914, so he was, I would imagine, in his late teens when he educated at a school in England. Not a I don't think it was a public school, but it was of that kind of background. And his parents expected him to leave school and train as a lawyer in this country, but Ken Snakes Johnson, or Ken Johnson, had other ideas. So he took himself off to New York when he was still a young man, where he saw some of the great jazz and swing music legends like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway in New York on stage. And he came back to England. And in 1936, he founded the first ever black British swing band called Ken Snakes. He became, by the time the war broke out in 1939, he became very, very well known up and down the country, partly because of his many radio appearances. And he had, during the early part of the war, a residency at the Café de Paris, which was one of the grandest nightclubs in London's West End, near Leicester Square. And he was there with his band. He was the band leader. He wasn't even musical. Some of the musicians in the band laughed. He had a charismatic personality. He was well over 6 foot tall. And when he stood in front of the band and wiggled and waggled, that's why he got the name Snake Hips, waving his baton, as you can see in the photograph. Audiences just loved him. And in 1940, he was interviewed on radio, BBC Radio, by Una Marson, who you can see in the photograph. So she also features in my book, Under Fire, for her BBC work. And a fragment of that interview still exists. The BBC did keep a very short fragment set in their sound archive, which was a joy to hear his voice. As I say, he made recordings, had a residency at the Café de Paris, and he is represented in Steve McQueen's film as well. And the Café de Paris is also depicted. But tragedy was to come, because on March the 8th, 1941, Snake Hips was with some friends having a meal in the evening. The time, it's the safest, really, for wealthy people. But Snake It said, I've got to get to the cafe, because I'm due to front the band at 11 o'clock at night. But his friends implored him not to go out. They said that bombs have started to fall across London, it's too dangerous. But because Ken was very tall, he could run, and he ran from this restaurant through this air raid, got to the Café de Paris, and as soon as he stood up in front of the band, a bomb found its way through an air shaft, exploded on the dance floor, killed and maimed many, many people. And poor Ken was also a victim of that air raid and died on the bandstand. When they found his body afterwards, there wasn't a mark on him, and that happened with some of the people sitting at tables they were just like dummies when the air raid wardens and the ambulance people came in. The devastation was horrific, which you can see in this photograph. You can imagine what a tragedy that was. But again, in the 1990s, around the same time I found the Black evacuee, I also tracked down Joe Denise. And Joe Denise was a lovely man. He was a black musician from Cardiff, born in Cardiff in South Wales, and he was a member of Ken's band and was pulled out of the Café de Paris alive, thank goodness. It was one of the worst nights of the Blitz, and an air raid was raging. No taxi was available. His friends begged him to stay, but Ken was determined to arrive on time for his appearance. The band member, after the bomb exploded in front of the bandstand, the band member, Joe Denise, was there. He later recalled in the interview that I did with him that the band had just started playing their signature tune, Oh Johnny, when the glass ceiling of the club was shattered. He said to me, as we started to play, there was an awful thud and all the lights went out. The ceiling fell in and the plaster came pouring down. People were yelling, and a stick of bombs went right across Leicester Square, through the Café de Paris, and further up Dean Street. The next thing I remember was being in a small van which had been converted into an ambulance. Then someone came up to me and said, Joe, Ken's dead. It broke me up. Reports of them, this is what I've written in my book, reports of the numbers of dead and injured varied, but most agree that over 30 people lost their lives that night at the Café de Paris, including its owner. 60 others were seriously injured, and another casualty was the Trinidadian saxophonist Dave Bubba Williams, who had been cut in half by the blast. However, Ken was discovered without a mark on his body, his red carnation still in the buttonhole of his tailcoat. And there were looters, as depicted in Steve McQueen's film. They prowled around the floor of the shattered nightclub, ripping open handbags, tearing rings off the hands of the dead and the unconscious. There was an epidemic of looting during the London Blitz, so serious that Scotland Yard set up a special squad to deal with it. And the actor Ballard Berkeley, who was later known for his role as the old major in the television sitcom Fawlty Towers, was working in his spare time as a special constable, and he was one of the first to arrive on the scene. The explosion, he said, within this confined space was tremendous. It blew legs off people, heads off people, and it exploded their lungs, so that when I went into this place, I saw people sitting at tables quite naturally, dead, dressed beautifully without a mark on them, dead. It was like looking at waxworks. And all this can be found in Steve McQueen's film. And finally, I want to include the story of George Arthur Roberts, because there is a very brief, if you blink you miss him, very brief representation of a black fireman trying to put the fires out created by the bombing. And you do see him, and I'm sure that's an allusion to George Arthur Roberts, who was born in Trinidad, served in the British Army in the First World War, but stayed in London, married and had two sons, one of whom I mentioned earlier, Cyril, who was captured at Dunkirk and was a prisoner of war during the Second World War, a German prisoner of war. But when the war broke out in 1939, George was too old for active service, so he volunteered for the National Fire Service, which later became the London Fire Brigade. And he he trained with the Auxiliary Fire Service, which was known as the National Fire Service from 1941. He was based at New Cross Fire Station, and in 1943 he was made a section leader and was responsible for organising the discussion and education groups of the wartime National Fire Service. And this was an important thing that he did, because in between air raids, firemen were left doing nothing. They had a lot of time on their hands. They were idle, waiting for the air raid siren, I beg your pardon, to go, and so they would then jump on their fire engines and go to the scenes of devastation. So George was responsible for this, which spread across the country, organising discussion groups with fellow officers, fire officers, so that they would have something to keep their minds occupied in between air raids. He also met and befriended a number of prominent artists and writers, including Norman Heppel. Norman Heppel was what they called an official war artist, and he painted George's portrait, which is now thankfully been saved by his granddaughter, who now owns it. In 1944, George was awarded the British Empire Medal, which was presented to him by King George VI at Buckingham Palace. And just to finish off, I'd like to mention the Camberwell Black History Walk, which I put together it was about a year or so ago. It was launched on Camberwell Green. So if any of you are in the vicinity of Camberwell Green, this was launched last February, the Camberwell Black History Walk, which I curated and included George Arthur Roberts as a local figure in this walk. I'm not trying to steal anything from Tony, who is the official Black History Walk gentleman, but I've done the local one to where I live, and as you can see, there's a photograph of me standing outside where George has it. You can just see the blue plaque which Southwark Heritage awarded. Well, the people of Southwark voted for George to have this blue plaque, which was unveiled by his great-granddaughter Samantha a few years back. But he also has this smaller plaque, which I showed just now, with all the images are by a wonderful local artist, Teo Fortunala. As you can see, is Teo and myself at the launch of the Camberwell Black History Walk last year. Teo is an old friend of mine. When I used to work in Peckham Library, we used to work together. I think Teo still works in the libraries. I left many years ago, but we've kept in touch, and I recommended to him to do the artists version of. So if you look at the Camberwell Black History Walk, you've got George Arthur Roberts, who lived at Warner Road in Camberwell. You've got Sam King, who was one of the first black mayor of Southwark back in 1983. He lived in Sears Road. Una Marson, who has a Southwark Heritage blue plaque outside her former home in Brunswick Park in Camberwell. Marianne Jean-Baptiste, who was up for the BAFTA last week. She should have won it for Mike Leigh's film Hard Truths, but she didn't. That was scandalous. She was born in the same hospital as myself, St Charles Hospital in Camberwell. She also has a Southwark Heritage blue plaque. I wonder how they got all these blue plaques. I'm sorry, it was me. John Boyega, who doesn't have a Southwark Heritage blue plaque yet, but has a mural at Havel Street, number 5 on the thing, at the Theatre Peckham, where he started his career. John Primero, who was a black Tudor that I discovered the story of, who's buried in the churchyard of St Charles Church. Harold Moody, whose church was in Wren Road, sadly now demolished, but it's just across from Camberwell Green, it would have been. And Belle Davis, who was a music hall entertainer in the Edwardian period, who appeared many times at the Camberwell Palace of Varieties, which is no longer there, but you can find her plaque on the walk as well. And in fact, the photograph, I just briefly mentioned it if you're wondering who the people are on the walk. I don't normally do walks. I don't have the capacity. I'm getting too old to do walks. But I did make an exception for a local trust and confidence police team. These are all police officers with me. And they asked me to do it for them, to take them on this black Camberwell Black History Walk, and we had a wonderful time. I had great fun. So, and it really helped them to understand the history of Black people in the local area. Before I close, I will just say that from my own personal perspective, because I haven't really said much about the film, I don't really want to say too much about Steve McQueen's film, because you now know that the Black characters in the film are based on real life people. But I think it is a wonderful film. I think it really was an emotional journey for me, because my parents were children during the Second World War, during the London Blitz, and they lived in London during the London Blitz. They were the same age as the little boy in the films, and they told me certain things about the London Blitz and the terror that it caused them as young children. And from that kind of perspective alone, I found the film had a big impact. I saw it at a special event organised by the New Black Film Collective at a cinema in Whitechapel, and I was on a panel discussion afterwards. A lot of young Black people were there, and they really loved the film. In the discussion afterwards, they really related to it and appreciated what Steve had done. I do have a few reservations about some of the things in the film, but overall, I thought it was brilliant. What then upset me was to discover really virulent, racist comments about the film. Not just, oh, this is a woke film. I mean, those comments came up on social media, but really racist comments about not accepting that this was actually based on truth, the true lives of people. And I think myself, I mean, racists are going to say that anyway, we know, but the general public who need to be more enlightened, and especially school children and young people in our schools and academies, need to know about the real life people that made this history and contributed to this pivotal part of British history, the Second World War. And they're not really being given enough information. I did a talk similar to this at a local Black youth organisation, Elevated Minds, recently, and also at a local academy near to where I live in Lambeth. And the young Black people were just blown away. They just couldn't. They just thought it was wonderful to hear these inspiring and empowering stories. And I'll finish there, and I'm happy to take questions. I hope there will be some questions, but I'm glad I've had this opportunity, thanks to Tony, to share this information with you. Thank you.
All right, so let's take a few questions. What you can do is you can type your question into the chat box. So you can, if you've got a question, just type it into the chat box there. We can have a look at it. Meanwhile, Mr. Bourne, can you switch your camera on, please? Because some people like to see your lovely face. So if you can switch on your camera.
I don't know how to find it. Do I just close?
I see. All you got to do is see what it says video at the bottom.
Sorry, I need to go back to you.
You click on video.
I need to close down the slides, yeah?
No, you don't. You can just click on video. And then
oh, start video.
Give a couple of seconds. Yeah, there we go. We can see you on your lovely filing cabinet. So right,
I can't see me. This is strange.
You can't see me because my camera switched off. So
right, okay.
Yeah.
Not that I need to see me. I can see me. I can just about see me.
The audience wants to see the talent in this case. So it's
right, okay. Well, I'll hold up the book then. That's the book.
There you go. You can see a nice book there. And
if you can't afford to buy it, make sure your library orders it for you. Make sure it's in every library. Oh, bless you. There I am. Under fire.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So any questions, just type them in. Michelle Farquharson says, "Thank you for your excellent presentation, Stephen." That's a comment, not a question, obviously. And someone else is saying thank you too. Oh, Tamla says, "Hi, Stephen." And my question is,
Jane to everyone says she's just finished reading the book and she's done a little hand clap. Thank you, Jane. That's really sweet.
There you go. Yeah.
Michelle says, thank you for your excellent presentation. Thank you, Michelle. That's really kind. Ah, Tamla, I met you at the screening in Whitechapel. I agree, it was a great evening. Oh, that's great. So I'm glad I mentioned it. I agree actually with Surinder Singh. I think Steve McQueen did go a little bit overboard, but I think, yeah, he wants me to comment. Shall I do that, Tony?
Yeah.
Surinder loved the film, but reservations. While it's important to make apparent the role of black people, it seemed that Steve McQueen went overboard. But I think because of, I would defend it simply by saying that because there haven't been any films about the home front anyway, he did throw them all in. And it's a fiction. It's not a documentary. It's a fiction film, not a documentary. So I would defend the film, although I would agree that he did go a bit overboard. What I didn't like in the film was the fact that he portrayed the looters as something out of Charles Dickens. Dreadful, absolutely dreadful. I didn't like the Stephen Graham, Kathy Burke characters at all. I thought they were completely over the top, completely out of place. But I loved the film as a whole. I thought the little boy and the other characters I thought that the actor that played Ekpenyon, the African air raid warden, was superb. Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah. There's a Q&A. There's a question. Somebody. Oh, will this be recorded? Yeah.
Jane says, I thought the movie was incredible and encouraged me to read my books that sat on my shelf for many years or years.
Annie Domingo. Hello, Annie. Annie's a great friend and a great champion, and Annie is interviewed in my next book that's coming out next month. Can I plug it? It's called Trailblazers of Black British Theatre. It covers the period 1825 to 1975, and Annie's in the chapter about black drama students. Trailblazers. It's published by the History Press. The hardback version was called Deep Are the Roots, but they've changed the cover and changed the cover. And I've added 3 new chapters about Una Marson, theatre work, Ida Shepley, I'm the only person who's heard of her, and Dame Cleo Lane. I highly recommend the chapter about Dame Cleo Lane, whose stage career is never given prominence. And in fact, I think Cleo is interviewed in Under Fire. Let me just double check. No, she's not, but she's in another book. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, Liz says, are there plans to do more illustrated talks about black film, theatre, and maybe even sports? I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
I don't do sports. I've never played a sport in my life. When I was at school, I used to run away.
But we did say, Stephen, we're going to do a talk on the updated theatre book. We'll do that for sure. And I'm going to try a book signing, a physical book signing somewhere in the West End. So look out for 2 more.
That would be fantastic.
Oh, yeah, it's going to happen, man. And just check out blackhistorywalks.co.uk and make sure you join our mailing list, because we do this sort of stuff all year long, and there's at least 3-4 events per month. If you go to blackhistorywalks.co.uk and join the mailing list, that will get advance notice of all the different events coming up. Michelle says, why do you think there's such resistance to representing black people during the World War I and World War II? And how can we challenge this?
Very difficult. But the simple answer, I do have an answer. And I will just say it. It's because the gatekeepers are very white and very middle class. So people that work in the film and television industries, they're not familiar with the kind of work that I do. I don't even think Steve McQueen knows who the hell I am. That doesn't bother me. It would have been nice to have had a chat to him when he was making the film. But it's about holding on to your identity and your knowledge. And while we've got so many white middle class people holding on to that in the very professions, if you like, that will enable more film and television dramas to do this. I think Steve McQueen has made a tremendous breakthrough with this film. But I was approached some years ago. I did a book called Black Poppies about black servicemen and the wider black community in Britain in the First World War. That book has been very, very successful. And I was approached by a black director, theatre playwright, and we went to Channel 4. No, we didn't. We went to Hat-Trick Productions, a top sort of production company, with a view to pitching this as a debate, but no, wouldn't do it. Hat-Trick Productions were on board, but Channel 4, who they get commissioned by, wouldn't do it. It's heartbreaking, but we need to. There's a young black actor, I think his name's Michael Ward. He was in Steve McQueen's Lovers Rock as part of the Small Act series. Michael Ward found a book that I'd written about black servicemen and women in the Second World War, came to see me with his agent. This was 2 or 3 years ago. And they sat in my living room, we chatted, I told him the stories of Ulrich Cross and all these men that were in my book. And nothing happened, never heard from them again. So there's this sort of resistance. I don't have any way into the film and television industry. It's just this world that's inaccessible to people like me. And I was very hurt last November when Blitz, Steve McQueen's Blitz, was premiered at the London Film Festival. I wasn't invited, but nobody knows who I am. Nobody knew that I'd written books on this subject and have been around for 30 odd years writing books on this subject. But that's the BFI for you. That's what they do. They exclude the very people that put these stories out there because they want all the sort of lovely sort of middle class people to be there and to rub shoulders with Steve McQueen. I'd love to meet him and talk to him about this, but I don't suppose that will ever happen. So I just carry on doing the work, and nothing gives me more pleasure than to go into schools sometimes when I'm asked and give talks, Black History Month talks or Black History talks, wherever I'm asked.
Yeah, well, if you actually want to have more of these sort of events taking place, what you can do is help us challenge the BFI with regard to their behaviors, in that this sort of thing would have taken place at the BFI, but they just made some redundancies which have affected our ability to put on presentations like this. So in the chat, there's a link to a petition. There's about 16,000 people signed it so far. Please sign it as well, and we can then use that to make them listen to the public they're supposed to serve and have more of these kind of events at these venues.
Can I just come in there? Because Surinder has agreed with me. We need more people of colour, male and female, in positions of power. I totally agree with you, Surinder, but we need more people of colour who are empowered and knowledgeable about their history in this country. If they're not, they're just going to... I'm going to be a bit, what's the word, controversial. I personally, it's just my personal view, was very disappointed with Lenny Henry's Three Little Birds. I felt that it wasn't really based on truth. It was based on stereotypes and misinformation. I couldn't bear to watch it, and I think it was a missed opportunity. The television series he did for ITV last year, and I think sometimes we expect black writers, filmmakers, television makers to do these productions, but they need to do the research. They need to read the books, like my books, for example. But I'm not the only one that writes Black British history books. There are many others. So obviously I'm going to plug my own work, but there is a range of books now, and it's so if they get into positions of power, they need to be conscious of that resource, if you like.
Yeah, we've got a 17-year-long track record of showing some really good films from African Caribbean. We've had Mr. Bourne down there plenty of times because he's got so much to say, and he's such a kind of valuable archive in effect. So that all those films
look at the archive.
Are in your head, innit? In effect. So yeah, we're gonna carry on doing this kind of work. because even this is a way of challenging the system and actually telling our stories from our own perspective. So we'll be doing.
Absolutely.
Carry on.
No, I haven't anything else to say unless anyone. Which
Michelle said something just there. Stephen, thank you for your words.
I'm a long-term fan of your work. Oh, thank you. Well, I appreciate you telling me that. I really do, because the mainstream media is still ignoring my books, and what I'm worried about is that they're ignoring, more importantly, the people in my books, which is really, really heartbreaking. So it's great that people do get to hear about my books, thanks to people like Tony sharing the information. But I've had a wonderful career. I mean, I can't complain. It's had its ups and downs. It's not always been an easy ride, but getting the books out there has been a marvelous sort of experience for me. Yeah.
All right. Well, as I said, we're going to have at least 2 more events with Mr. Bourne, online and in person. So check out the website blackhistorywalks.co.uk and make sure you join the mailing list.
Sorry, Tony, I forgot to. It was the last slide. I do have a website. So those of you who don't know my work, that's the final slide. You can check out my books on my website, which, yeah. Michelle asks, on my website, there is a contact page. So you can contact me through my website, through the contact page.
All right. If you tell me it, I'll put it in the chat. Is it stephenbourne.com for that?
stephenbourne.co.uk.
All right. So I'll put it in the chat. www.stephenbourne.co.uk. Is that right?
stephenbourne.co.uk.
It is in the chat now.
That's it. That should work.
Yeah.
Or you can just Google it.
just Googling. All right. So we hope to see you in the future, some other events. Other than that, thank you for attending online, and we will see you again shortly. I'm going to put Black History
I have
Walks
been reading the messages that have been posted, and thank you to everyone that attended and have made all these wonderful comments in the chat bar. I managed to bring that up, so I really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you, Tony, and thank you, everyone.
Problem. And I'll be in touch about some other dates for the future, so just check your messages.
Oh, you can see both of them, yeah. Both my thumbs. All right.
And
you take care.
Ciao.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.